Welcome the anointed ones. Not everyone who claps for you is happy for you. Some are just checking to see if you'll trip. There's a brutal truth they don't tell you. The bigger your light, the more it exposes the shadows hiding around you. Sometimes the ones who seem indifferent or even hostile weren't always enemies. They were people who felt too much but said too little. And when feelings get buried alive, they don't die peacefully. They come back swinging. Psychologists confirm that suppressed emotions are like ticking time bombs. They always find a way to detonate. In your case, you were the spark they didn't plan for. While you walked around just minding your destiny, you unknowingly triggered old insecurities, hidden admiration, and even secret love they were too prideful to confess. Instead of dealing with it like healthy adults, well, let's just say some people would rather start a war than send a congratulations text, because apparently self-awareness is still out of stock. Tonight, we're ripping the mask clean off. The clash wasn't random, the eruption wasn't over nothing. It was a full-blown emotional jailbreak. And you, dear chosen one, were the one thing they could never silence or unsee. Let's get into it. Number 1. They admired you in secret, but chose sabotage over confession because your existence exposed their own mediocrity. They admired you in secret, but instead of being honest about it, they chose sabotage. Deep down, they knew you were doing something they couldn't, living fully, boldly, unapologetically, and that burned them up inside. Every time you walked into the room, you didn't have to say a word. Your very existence put a spotlight on everything they had been avoiding in themselves. It wasn't just jealousy. It was deeper. It was the quiet realization that they weren't brave enough to do what you were doing. You made them feel the weight of their own mediocrity without even trying. The crazy part is, it started with admiration. They looked at you and thought, damn, I wish I had that kind of courage, that kind of spirit. But admiration quickly turned bitter when they realized clapping for you would mean admitting to themselves that they weren't putting in the same work. Instead of stepping up, they decided it was easier to tear you down. They thought if they could create enough noise, enough drama, maybe you'd second-guess yourself. Maybe you'd fall off your path. Maybe you'd shrink just enough for them to feel big again. But the real issue was never you. It was never about anything you did wrong. You just showed them a version of life they had convinced themselves they couldn't have. And when a person's self-image is built on settling, seeing someone who refuses to settle feels like a personal attack, even if you never aimed a single blow. So they hid their true feelings. They laughed too hard at your mistakes. They threw shade when you weren't around. They built little alliances against you, thinking that somehow, if enough people doubted you, it would erase what they felt about you deep down. It didn't work. It never does. Because admiration disguised as hate always exposes itself in the end. Number 2. Your presence didn't just threaten their comfort. It shattered their carefully built lies about themselves. Your presence didn't just threaten their comfort. It shattered the lies they spent years building about who they were. You didn't walk in swinging. You didn't call anybody out. You just existed. And somehow, that was enough to make them feel completely exposed. Because when someone has built their whole identity around half-truths and safe choices, someone like you feels like a walking, breathing accusation. They told themselves they were doing fine. They convinced themselves that settling was maturity, that playing it small was wisdom, that giving up on their dreams was just growing up. But then you showed up, stubborn, loud, messy, alive, and everything they worked so hard to believe started to fall apart. You didn't match the story they wrote for themselves. You were the proof that they gave up too soon. That's why they clashed with you. Not because you hurt them, not because you disrespected them, but because you made it impossible for them to stay asleep. Your energy woke up parts of them they had locked away, dreams they buried, risks they didn't take, chances they let slip by. And instead of letting your presence inspire them to try again, they chose to hate you for it. It's easier to label you too much than admit they chose too little. It's easier to call you selfish than face the fact that they abandoned parts of themselves a long time ago. So they picked a side. Not because you were wrong, but because you were a threat to the comfort they had built on lies. The thing they'll never say out loud is this. Deep down, They know you didn't come to destroy anything. You just showed up as yourself. But for people living behind masks, sometimes the truth of someone else's life feels like a wrecking ball. And once the mask starts slipping, the whole game falls apart. Number 3. They loved the idea of you, until the reality of you demanded they evolve, and they refused. They loved the idea of you, the concept, the potential, the version of you they could admire from a distance. That was easy. That was safe. Loving the idea of you didn't cost them anything. They could cheer for you, even daydream about you, without having to actually confront themselves. But the real you, the one who demanded growth, who refused to shrink, who challenged everything fake around you just by breathing, that version scared them. Because the real you wasn't just a pretty idea. You were a living demand, a mirror, a challenge they couldn't mute. Being around you meant being uncomfortable. It meant they had to either rise to meet you or fall behind and feel the sting of it every time you shined. And most people, when faced with that kind of pressure, don't rise. They retreat. Or worse, they attack. They loved you when you were quiet, when you were easy to manage, when you played the role they assigned you. But when you stepped fully into yourself, when you started moving differently, thinking differently, dreaming bigger, their quiet support turned into loud resentment. You made it impossible for them to stay in their comfort zone without feeling like cowards. They didn't hate you because you changed. They hated you because you made them realize they hadn't. And instead of dealing with that, instead of growing, they decided it was easier to create distance, drama, and division. That's the part they won't admit, that deep down, they never stopped loving you. They just couldn't stand what loving you demanded from them. The idea of you was beautiful, safe, inspirational. The reality of you? The reality forced them to look in the mirror, and they weren't ready for that kind of reflection. Number 4. They didn't just hide love. They buried admiration under layers of resentment because worship felt like weakness. They didn't just hide love. They buried it. They took genuine admiration, something pure, something real, and smothered it under layers of resentment because admitting it would have made them feel weak. To them, showing love wasn't beautiful. It was dangerous. It meant giving you the upper hand. It meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability was something they promised themselves they'd never do again. They needed you more than they ever let on. Your energy, your resilience, your spirit. It lit something up inside them they thought was long dead. But needing you felt like losing control. And for people who lived their lives trying to stay 2 steps ahead of hurt, the idea of needing someone feels like setting yourself on fire and hoping you survive the flames. So instead of admitting it, they envied you. They envied the way you moved without apology. They envied the way you kept choosing yourself when they kept choosing fear. They envied the fact that, while they hesitated, you acted. While they second-guessed everything, you trusted your instincts. Every time you chose yourself, it rubbed salt into the wounds they didn't want to acknowledge. In another life, a braver life, they might have been your biggest supporters. They might have stood by you, celebrated you, and grown alongside you. But in this life, fear won, pride won, ego won, and love lost. They buried their admiration so deep that even they started to believe they hated you. But here's the secret they can't escape. Buried feelings don't die. They rot. They turn into bitterness, sarcasm, competition, and cheap shots disguised as jokes. They leak out in passive-aggressive comments and sudden coldness. They think they've hidden it well, but anyone who looks close enough can see the truth bleeding through the cracks. They never stopped needing you. They just couldn't find the courage to need you out loud. Number 5. They crafted conflicts because your very peace unsettled their chaos. They crafted conflicts because your very peace unsettled their chaos. You didn't have to argue, compete, or even defend yourself. Just being calm, clear, and focused was enough to throw their whole world off balance. You weren't playing their games, and that alone made you dangerous. People who live in constant noise and drama don't know what to do when they meet someone who doesn't flinch. Your peace exposed the mess they had spent years pretending was normal. You became the mirror they couldn't escape. Every time they looked at you, they saw everything they were running from: the anxiety, the anger, the fear, the lack of control. You showed them what stability looked like, what healing looked like, what moving with purpose looked like, and it killed them a little inside because it reminded them of the work they hadn't done. They didn't want to fix themselves. That would take too much honesty, too much effort. It was easier to try and shatter the mirror. If they could just break you, disrupt you, drag you into their chaos, maybe they wouldn't have to face what they saw anymore. Maybe they could convince themselves you weren't really different, just fake, just lucky, just temporarily ahead. So they stirred up conflict. They poked, they gossiped, they tested your patience, hoping you'd snap and prove them right. They wanted to believe your peace was a mask, something they could rip off. They needed it to be a lie because if it wasn't, then they'd have to admit that real peace is possible, and that they were the ones choosing chaos every day. But here's the catch. Peace that's real doesn't break under pressure. It doesn't crack just because someone else is uncomfortable. It gets stronger, it gets quieter, it makes the chaos scream even louder, not because you changed, but because your stillness became unbearable for them to ignore. They couldn't break you. They just broke themselves trying. Number 6. Some people would rather destroy the source of their inspiration than admit they needed saving. Some people would rather destroy the source of their inspiration than admit they needed saving. It's brutal, but it's true. They saw something in you that lit a spark, a way out, a way up, a glimpse of a life bigger than the one they settled for. But instead of reaching for it, instead of letting that spark grow into something real, they panicked. They felt exposed, small, even helpless in the light you carried. And instead of letting you lift them, they tried to pull you down. You became their private battleground between longing and loathing. Part of them admired you so deeply it hurt. Part of them resented you just as fiercely because you reminded them of how far they were from who they wanted to be. They were torn in two, caught between wanting to stand beside you and wanting to tear you apart so they wouldn't have to feel so painfully aware of their own shortcomings. They hated that they needed you, hated that your strength highlighted their weakness, hated that your boldness made their fear look pathetic. And because pride can't stand to owe anyone anything, they decided it was easier to treat you like an enemy than face the fact that deep down they wished they had what you have. So they attacked what they didn't understand. They threw shade at what they secretly wished would heal them. They treated your light like a threat instead of a gift. And even when they tried to convince themselves they were better off without you, part of them stayed haunted by the idea that losing you meant losing the last piece of hope they had left. The war they started wasn't really about you at all. It was about the parts of themselves they couldn't forgive, the dreams they had given up on, the lives they were too scared to chase. You didn't break them. You just showed them the truth they spent their whole lives avoiding, and some people would rather kill the messenger than hear the message. Number 7. Their attack was never about your flaws. It was about the unforgiving spotlight you cast on theirs. Their attack was never about your flaws. It was about the unforgiving spotlight you cast on theirs. They needed a reason to make you the problem, because accepting the truth would have meant looking too closely at themselves. You didn't walk around pretending to be perfect. You didn't claim to have it all figured out. But what you did have was authenticity. And that's what made you dangerous to them. People can deal with fake. They know how to fake it too. But real? Real terrifies people who are living behind walls. Your honesty stripped away their excuses. Your courage made their fear look obvious. Your ability to be raw and unapologetic exposed the masks they couldn't survive without. You weren't just living, you were living without hiding, and that's what made them feel naked every time you walked into a room. They didn't attack you because you were wrong. They attacked you because you made hiding impossible. You made pretending harder. You made denial feel unbearable. You weren't trying to expose them, but your presence did it anyway. Just by being who you were, you pulled back the curtains on everything they hoped no one would ever notice. So they picked at you. They exaggerated your mistakes. They twisted your words. They found anything they could use to shift the focus away from themselves. Because if they could convince everyone you were flawed, they wouldn't have to answer the bigger question. Why did your honesty make them feel so uncomfortable in the first place? The truth is, Your flaws were never the threat. Your freedom was. Your willingness to live wide open, to stand in your truth without asking for permission, made them feel exposed in ways they couldn't handle. You didn't embarrass them. Their own reflection did, and they blamed you for holding the mirror. Number 8. They didn't misunderstand you. They understood you too well, and that terrified them. They didn't misunderstand you. They understood you too well, and that terrified them. People love to act like you were confusing, like you were hard to figure out, like you were too complicated to deal with. But that was never the real issue. The truth is, they saw you clearly. They knew exactly who you were. They just didn't know what to do with the truth staring them in the face. You stood for everything they had buried. You showed up with the kind of clarity, passion, and authenticity they had convinced themselves didn't exist anymore. Maybe never did. They didn't have to guess what you wanted, who you were, or what you stood for. It was obvious, and that scared them, because deep down they knew they couldn't fake that level of realness. You didn't unnerve them by being chaotic. You unnerved them by being undeniable. You moved in a way that made excuses crumble. You believed in yourself in a way that made self-doubt look foolish. Every move you made, every dream you chased, every boundary you set, every time you chose your peace, quietly screamed a truth they weren't ready to face. They had the same choices, and they chose differently. It wasn't confusion that made them distance themselves from you. It was the uncomfortable realization that your life was proof they had betrayed themselves. Your bravery made their fear louder. Your progress made their stagnation more obvious. Your happiness made their bitterness harder to justify. You didn't reveal their lack of understanding. You revealed their lack of action. You revealed how much settling they had done. You revealed how much of themselves they left behind. And instead of rising to meet you where you were, they decided it was safer to tear you down and pretend you were the problem. They didn't get you wrong. They got you right. Too right. And it scared them to death. Number 9. Hidden love often mutates into hatred when the ego can't survive the vulnerability of admiration. Hidden love often mutates into hatred when the ego can't survive the vulnerability of admiration. Love, in its purest form, requires humility. The willingness to admit that someone else holds power over your emotions, your thoughts, even your choices. But the ego can't stand to be humbled. So when they felt something for you that they didn't know how to handle, something real, something intense, they buried it. They locked it away under layers of pride, self-protection, and fear. But the thing about buried feelings is this: they don't stay buried forever. When love is pushed down, it has a way of resurfacing, often in the ugliest form: hatred. It didn't start as hate, but it sure as hell ended up that way. Their attraction to you, their secret need for you, twisted into resentment because they couldn't admit the truth to themselves. They couldn't admit that they needed you, that they depended on you in ways they weren't willing to face. And so, hatred became their shield. It was easier to lash out, to turn you into the enemy, to find faults in you and make you the villain of their own story, than to sit with the fact that they were emotionally defenseless around you. It was safer to throw stones than to let themselves fall in admiration, to let themselves be vulnerable enough to admit that they craved what you had, and that they couldn't have it because they were too afraid to reach for it. Every time they tried to cut you down, every nasty comment, every cold look, it was all just noise masking the truth they couldn't handle. They needed you, but their ego couldn't bear it. So instead of acknowledging their need, they burned bridges, turned love into hatred, and created a rift that could never be healed by anything but honesty. They didn't want to hate you, they just didn't know how to love you without feeling like they were losing everything they thought made them strong. Number 10. They didn't lose you because of the clash. They lost themselves trying to pretend they never cared. They didn't lose you because of the clash. They lost themselves trying to pretend they never cared. The fight wasn't the cause of the break, it was just the symptom. The real tragedy was that somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves that letting you go would make them stronger, make them freer, make them right. They buried their feelings under the noise of the argument, under the coldness they tried to project, hoping if they denied it long enough, they could pretend the connection never existed. But the truth is, when you bury something that deep, it doesn't just vanish, it festers. It leaves a hole that nothing else can fill. They convinced themselves they were walking away from you, but they were actually walking away from the person they could have been. The person who was brave enough to love, to admit they cared, to be vulnerable. They chose the facade of indifference because facing what they felt for you would have meant facing all the things they were too afraid to change about themselves. And in that moment they traded their authenticity for a lie. What they didn't realize was, in trying to push you out, they pushed a part of themselves away too. The part that had the courage to care, to feel deeply, to be real. And now that loss will haunt them in silence, every day. They'll never say it aloud, but it will echo in the quiet moments when they have to confront the fact that they could have had something real with you, something worth fighting for, if only they hadn't let fear dictate their every move. That regret won't scream at them. It'll linger in the background, soft but persistent, reminding them of the truth they'll never admit. They didn't lose you in the clash. They lost themselves in the lie they told to protect their fragile ego. And that silence will haunt them long after the fight is over. Number 11. You were a living prophecy they weren't ready to receive. So they labeled you a problem instead of a blessing. You were a living prophecy they weren't ready to receive. So they labeled you a problem instead of a blessing. There's something unsettling about meeting your destiny before you're ready to accept it. When you showed up in their life, you weren't just a passing moment or a fleeting encounter. You were the living, breathing embodiment of everything they had ever dreamed of or feared, all wrapped into one. You were a sign, a message, a turning point they weren't prepared for. And instead of embracing it, they tried to dismiss it. They couldn't deal with the fact that everything about you felt like fate, like you were meant to cross their path for a reason they couldn't yet understand. So they did what most people do when they feel confronted with something too powerful. They ran from it. They labeled you a problem because facing you would have meant facing their own inadequacies, their own fear of change. The truth is, you weren't a problem at all. You were an invitation to rise, to evolve, to become more than they had ever allowed themselves to be. But that's a terrifying thing when you're not ready to grow. Destiny isn't kind. It doesn't wait for perfect timing. It doesn't ask if you're ready. It just shows up. And when it does, it forces you to face parts of yourself that you've spent years avoiding. You showed them who they could be, and that was too much to bear. It wasn't you that scared them. It was the potential you represented, the life they could have had if only they had the courage to stop hiding from their own future. So they turned on you. They built walls instead of bridges, cast you as an inconvenience rather than the blessing you were meant to be. But deep down, they knew. The moment you walked into their life, they were standing face to face with the person they were always meant to become. And they weren't ready for that. Not everyone can handle encountering their destiny too soon. Number 12. They waged wars because peace with you meant surrendering their illusions. They waged wars because peace with you meant surrendering their illusions. You were a threat not because you were aggressive or confrontational, but because you were everything their false reality couldn't survive. You didn't ask for perfection, didn't demand submission, but your very presence exposed the lies they had been telling themselves about who they were, who they could be, and what they truly wanted. And that scared them more than anything. Their illusions were their comfort zone, the stories they told themselves to avoid facing the harsh truths about their lives. They built walls around those illusions, dressed them up in pride and prideful habits, convincing themselves that what they had was enough. But when you came into the picture, calm, real, unafraid, you didn't fit the mold. You didn't play by the rules of the fake world they'd constructed, and that threatened everything they thought was safe. To have peace with you would have meant tearing down those walls. It would have meant admitting they had been holding on to things that didn't serve them. It would have meant facing the hard truth that they had been choosing comfort over growth, stagnation over evolution, and ego over connection. And that was something they couldn't do. They preferred to fight, to argue, to keep things at war. Because fighting meant they didn't have to face the uncomfortable reality that they were settling. Fighting meant they could keep pretending, keep hiding behind excuses, keep living in a world where they didn't have to confront their own failure to live authentically. Peace with you would have forced them to grow, to let go of their outdated beliefs and ideas, to face themselves honestly. And that's a fight most people aren't willing to win. They love their illusions more than they could ever love truth. Because illusions are easy, truth requires change, and change is a war they weren't prepared to fight. Number 13. Their hidden feelings were never small. They were too big to fit into their pride-swollen hearts. Their hidden feelings were never small. They were too big to fit into their pride-swollen hearts. What they felt for you wasn't something they could easily shove aside or contain. It wasn't just admiration or a passing attraction. It was deep, overwhelming, something that could have changed them if they'd allowed it to. But their pride, that unyielding, fragile ego of theirs, couldn't make room for feelings that big. It was easier to pretend, to push those emotions down, to act like they didn't matter. But pride has its limits. You can only stuff so much into a heart that's already overflowing with self-importance before it starts to crack. They couldn't admit how much they cared, because that would have meant letting go of their carefully crafted image. It would have meant lowering the walls they had spent years building around their vulnerability. And those walls were all they had left to protect them from the world. Or so they thought. But the truth is, feelings don't get small just because you refuse to acknowledge them. They grow, they expand, they build pressure. And so those feelings exploded into conflict. Every argument, every accusation, every moment of tension between you was really just a manifestation of the emotional chaos inside them. They didn't know how to express what they felt without dismantling the false identity they had created for themselves. They didn't know how to be vulnerable without feeling like they were losing control. And instead of growing big enough to hold those feelings, they let them tear them apart. It wasn't about you. It was about their refusal to change. You didn't break them. They broke themselves by not being brave enough to embrace what they felt. If they had just been willing to step outside their pride, they would have seen that love doesn't need to be feared. But they couldn't. So, they chose conflict. They chose to let everything explode rather than deal with the truth of what was inside. Number 14. You didn't create the clash. You revealed the war they were already losing inside themselves. You didn't create the clash. You revealed the war they were already losing inside themselves. The truth is, the conflict wasn't really about you at all. It never was. It was about everything they had buried, ignored, or refused to face within themselves. When you came into their life, you didn't start the fight. You just exposed the battle they had been fighting for years, deep within their own soul. You didn't trigger their anger or confusion. You brought it to the surface because you forced them to confront the parts of themselves they'd been desperately trying to ignore. Their frustration wasn't with you. It was with their own inability to grow, to heal, to face the things they had left unfinished. The peace you exuded, the strength you carried, the authenticity you embodied were all reminders of the work they had yet to do on themselves. And instead of rising to meet it, they chose to lash out. They attacked you because you made it impossible to keep pretending everything was fine. You were the mirror they couldn't avoid, showing them the cracks they had been covering up with distractions and denial. The truth was, they weren't losing control because of you. They were losing control because they had never fully faced the chaos within. You were just the catalyst. The battlefield was their own unhealed soul. They hadn't dealt with their past, their fears, their insecurities, and you made that undeniable. You didn't bring the war to them, you simply made them realize it had been raging inside them all along. The deeper they buried their wounds, the more desperately they tried to keep up the facade. the more intense the conflict became when you showed up. You didn't start it. You just made it impossible for them to keep pretending they weren't already losing. In the end, the clash wasn't about you. It was about the things they couldn't reconcile within themselves. You were never the cause of the chaos. You were simply the catalyst that forced them to face the war they had been waging in silence. Every fight, every accusation, every attempt to tear you down was nothing more than a reflection of the struggle they couldn't escape. They couldn't run from the truth of what you represented. The truth they weren't ready to accept about their own fears, regrets, and missed opportunities. You weren't the problem. You were the mirror they didn't want to look into, the reality they couldn't bear to acknowledge. But in refusing to face what was staring them in the face, they ended up pushing you away. And now, the silence after the storm will be louder than any argument ever could be. The regret, the unspoken words, the unfinished feelings, it will all haunt them in the quiet moments when they're forced to confront what they lost. In the end, you were the one they needed, even if they never had the courage to admit it. And while they may try to convince themselves that walking away was the right choice, the truth is, it's not you they left behind. It's the opportunity to grow, to heal, and to be the person they could have been. The war they waged wasn't one they could win, because in the end, you're not the one they were really fighting. They were fighting themselves all along. If this resonated with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Like if you felt the truth of this, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the right words at the right time can change everything. You've just witnessed a truth so powerful it could shift perspectives, so spread it. Stay tuned because we're just getting started.